And our next guest says the U.S. is approaching sanctions in the wrong way here. He's here to tell us why. And we should mention that Ken Pollack spent 7 years with the CIA as a Persian Gulf military analyst. He's director currently of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Good morning to you, Ken. A lot of heat off of these remarks from the Secretary of State. Tell me how significant it is for her to say that Iran's turning into a military dictatorship.
Sure. Well, good morning, Margaret. Thanks for having me on. At one level, I think that the Secretary is simply saying some things that everyone recognizes. There's a great deal of consensus out there that this is the direction that Iran is heading in, the comments of the Supreme Leader notwithstanding. What's really significant about them is that when an administration takes this kind of a line, it's obviously sending a very strong signal. And the signal that they're trying to send here is that they're really getting frustrated with engagement, that they have tried for basically a year to engage the Iranian regime. They, in fact, were hewing to that line even after most of the experts and most of the Iranians were calling on the U.S. government to change its policy. And I think that what you're seeing the Secretary of State doing is making clear that the administration is shifting. They have played out engagement. They have given the Iranians every opportunity, and the Iranians simply haven't shown any interest in engagement. And as a result, the U.S. is now going to shift over to a sanctions mode, which, as the president said right from the get-go, was going to be their strategy.
But there are already 3 different levels of sanctions that the UN has against Iran. What does another layer do? I mean, how do the 4th time around these become more effective?
Right. Well, this is the big question, Margaret. As you pointed out, there are already 3 UN resolutions applying sanctions on Iran. But the truth is that all of those sanctions are really quite weak. They were directed at very specific Iranian individuals and groups. No one believed that they were going to be terribly meaningful. Really, they were of symbolic value. And what the administration is trying to do now is to figure out whether they can't get a new resolution through the UN that would have more teeth, that would really bite the Iranian regime and force them to change its behavior. And I think that's right now a very open question.
I know one of the comments that the Secretary of State made to Bloomberg in those comments in Saudi Arabia, she mentioned a U.S. fund to basically prevent hackers in Iran from taking down some of the communications that have been out there during some of these protests that we have seen. It's the first mention that I personally had seen of this. What do you know?
Well, the U.S. government has been trying very actively to try to prevent the Iranians from controlling information for a number of years. And, you know, that goes on at the kind of most obvious level of things like Radio Free Europe and what the U.S. has is called Radio Farda, which is a Persian language broadcast that they try to get into Iran. But you've also seen the U.S. and Iran engaging in a form of cyber warfare, where the Iranians are trying very hard to shut down the information that comes into Iran, and the United States is trying very hard to keep those channels open so that people inside of Iran can talk about what's going on there and so that news from the outside world can get into the country.
You know, whenever the issue of Iran surfaces, the question of what this could potentially mean for disruption of crude oil supply gets to top of mind in the marketplace. Tell me, I mean, how much potential is there truly in a worst-case scenario for the Iranian Navy to go and disrupt the Strait of Hormuz?
Very little, to tell you the truth. The Iranians understand full well, we've seen this, that if they actually ever tried to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian Navy would lead a very brief, exciting existence. The U.S. Navy would obliterate the Iranian Navy very quickly. It would simply be a matter of time, probably days, maybe a few weeks, for the U.S. Navy to shut down Iranian air defenses, then move in, clear whatever mines were laid, destroy Iranian surface naval assets. The Iranians get this. It's actually much more useful for them to always have the threat, to be able to say, hey, we can do this, than to actually do it. Because if they do it, they will be crossing the world's red line. No one on the planet wants to see Persian Gulf oil disrupted. If the Iranians ever did it, I think any sympathy, any goodwill for the Iranians that existed anywhere would go out the window, and everyone would rally behind the U.S. to say, you've got to open the Strait of Hormuz and do whatever it takes.
So small likelihood there. Lastly, I want to ask you, Ken, because your group, Saban Center, co-branded one of these forums being held in the Middle East over the past few days that the Secretary of State attended. How important is the dialogue, is the rhetoric that's being expressed in the Arab world by the Secretary of State in helping to further this cause of cracking down on Iran?
Look, it's critical. The U.S. is facing an uphill fight, and the U.S. has got to get the Arab world behind it. Other countries are going to look at it and say, look, if you can't get the Arabs, who are clearly those most threatened by Iran and most frightened of Iran, if you can't get the Arabs on board, why on earth should we help you? And beyond that, a last point, the Saudis are critical. They're critical in getting the Russians and the Chinese, both of them have tremendously important commercial relationships. So the Saudis have got to help out.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight there. Ken Pollack, the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution.